The gleaming black BMW caught the morning sunlight as Sarah Thompson hummed along to jazz music celebrating the $1 million consulting deal she had just closed with Microsoft. Her success at age 32 made her one of the youngest senior partners at Richardson Global Consulting, but she never forgot her humble beginnings growing up in the very neighborhood she was driving through. Her brother, Michael, now the city's first black mayor, had always taught her to remember their roots, which was why she still visited their childhood community center every Tuesday to mentor young entrepreneurs. The morning air felt crisp and full of promise as she adjusted her designer blazer in the rearview mirror, mentally preparing for her next meeting with the city's Economic Development Board, where she volunteered her expertise to help minority-owned businesses secure funding. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michael, reminding her about their weekly family dinner, where they would discuss his latest initiative for community policing reform. If only she knew how personal that topic was about to become. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her mirror, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah checked her speedometer. Knowing she hadn't been speeding, she had learned early in life to be extra cautious while driving her luxury car through certain neighborhoods. Despite her success and status, she was all too familiar with the unspoken rules of being black in America, even in their supposedly progressive city where her brother led the government. Officer James Bradley watched the BMW from his patrol car, his lip curling as he ran the plates. The registration came back clean. But something about seeing such an expensive vehicle in this area rubbed him the wrong way. 20 years on the force had taught him that things were rarely what they seemed, especially in this neighborhood that had resisted his attempts to clean it up his way. He didn't care that crime statistics had actually improved under the new mayor's leadership. Bradley believed in old-school policing, and he was determined to send a message. Sarah took a deep breath as she pulled over, following years of careful instruction from her father, a retired judge, about how to handle police encounters. She placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, her law degree from Harvard hanging forgotten in her downtown office. As she prepared herself for what experience told her could be a challenging interaction, she glanced at her dashboard camera, making sure it was recording something her brother had insisted she install after taking office. The street grew quiet as neighbors began to notice the scene unfolding. Some recognized Sarah from her frequent community work. Others simply saw another black person being pulled over in their neighborhood, where such stops had become all too common. Despite the mayor's promises of change, Mr. Jenkins, who ran the corner store where Sarah and Michael had bought candy, as children stepped outside her shop, phone already raised, ready to record whatever might happen next. Inside her car, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. Just moments ago, she had been reviewing proposals for a new police sensitivity training program she helped develop as part of her brother's task force on law enforcement reform. She could never have imagined she was about to become the centerpiece of exactly why such programs were desperately needed. Her recent keynote speech at the National Conference on Police Accountability seemed almost prophetic now. Officer Bradley took his time approaching the vehicle, making a show of authority with each deliberate step, his boots clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that had intimidated countless civilians before, unaware that this traffic stop would soon become the catalyst for his downfall and a landmark case in police reform. The morning sun continued to shine on Sarah's spotless BMW as the next few moments prepared to unleash a chain of events that would rock the entire police department, expose years of systematic abuse, and ultimately force the city to confront its deepest issues with law enforcement accountability. The dashboard camera recorded silently as Bradley reached the driver's window, his face already twisted into a familiar sneer that had gone unchecked for far too long. Sarah felt her heart race. Despite her accomplished background, her master's in business administration, her numerous community service awards, and her position as the mayor's sister, none of that mattered in this moment, as she was about to experience firsthand why her brother had made police reform his top priority. Officer James Bradley swaggered toward the vehicle, his boots clicking against the pavement with deliberate slowness, a habit had developed over 20 years of trying to intimidate those he considered suspicious. His right hand rested casually on his holster, while his left swung a tactical flashlight. Despite the bright morning sunshine, Sarah felt her chest tighten as she watched him approach through her side mirror. Her years of handling tough boardroom negotiations seemed insignificant in the face of the barely concealed hatred she saw in his eyes. The growing crowd of onlookers only fueled Bradley's anger. He despised how phones were increasingly being pointed at officers during routine stops. Though his body camera was supposed to be recording, he had developed a habit of positioning himself just right to obscure its view, a trick had shared with other officers who preferred the old ways of policing. He had noticed that Sarah's luxury car was equipped with multiple camera angles, catching every twitch of his facial expressions and each aggressive movement. License and registration. Bradley barked the words like an order to a subordinate, purposely leaning into the window, his badge catching the sunlight as he invaded Sarah's personal space. She could smell the coffee on his breath mixed with the lingering scent of cigarettes. Her mind flashed back to the diversity training sessions Shed conducted for the police department, wondering if Bradley had been one of the officers who had sat in the back row making dismissive comments throughout her presentation. Sarah reached for her designer handbag with deliberate slowness, announcing each movement as her father had taught her years ago. Growing up as a judge's daughter had given her an intimate understanding of law enforcement protocol, but she could tell immediately that Bradley wasn't interested in following standard procedures. His eyes narrowed at her careful compliance, clearly disappointed by her professional demeanor. The atmosphere grew thicker with tension as Bradley snatched her offered documents, his calloused fingers leaving visible smudges on her pristine driver's license. Sarah noticed his name tag was slightly askew on his uniform, which otherwise showed signs of meticulous care, a detail that would later become significant in the investigation of his past conduct records, showing a pattern of perfectly maintained uniforms, but increasingly sloppy adherence to department policies. Well, Bradley drawled, examining her license with exaggerated scrutiny. What brings someone like you to this neighborhood? His emphasis on you carried years of prejudice. Sarah could feel her law degree and corporate success evaporating in his eyes, replaced by nothing more than the color of her skin. She kept her expression neutral, even as her pulse quickened, remembering the community center youth she mentored just blocks away who faced similar treatment every day. Mrs. Jenkins from the corner store had now pulled out her phone, joining other neighbors in documenting the increasingly tense situation. The gathered crowd murmured among themselves, some recognizing Sarah from her regular volunteer work, others simply seeing another example of what they considered routine harassment. Bradley seemed to feed off the attention, his shoulders squaring as he held up Sarah's license to the sunlight as if suspecting it was counterfeit. The dashboard camera captured every micro-expression that crossed Bradley's face as he began what appeared to be a rehearsed performance, one that had likely played out numerous times before, only now he had unknowingly chosen the worst possible target for his practiced intimidation. Sarah remained still, her hands visible on the steering wheel, as she recalled her brother's recent words at a city council meeting about the importance of documentation in creating lasting change in law enforcement. Sarah noticed Bradley's finger moving to tap his body camera, a gesture Shed later learned from department investigations was his signal to fellow officers that he was about to go off book. She activated her phone's secondary recording feature using the discreet button her brother had insisted she have installed. Even as Bradley began his theatrical inspection of her credentials, his face contorting into expressions of mock disbelief that would soon be analyzed by police accountability experts across the country. The dashboard camera captured every excruciating detail in high definition as Officer Bradley held Sarah's license up to the morning light, turning it this way and that with an exaggerated flourish that would later be viewed millions of times on social media. His body language screamed contempt as he put on a show for the gathering crowd, his fingers pressing against the edges of her ID with increasing pressure that made his knuckles whiten. Sarah watched in stunned silence as 20 years of perfect driving record and professional credentials were literally in the hands of a man who seemed determined to establish his dominance over the situation. The expensive dashboard camera system her brother had insisted she install captured multiple angles of Bradley's face, his expressions shifting between mock surprise and cruel amusement as he pretended to study the clearly valid license. So Miss Sarah Thompson. Bradley drew out her name like it was a joke. Fancy address, fancy car, fancy job. He snickered, reading details from her license, all while his fingers began to apply pressure to its edges. The sound of the plastic starting to bend was picked up clearly by the car's high-end audio system. You know how many fake IDs I see in this neighborhood every week, people trying to pretend they're something they're not. His words carried the weight of years of unchecked prejudice. The growing crowd of onlookers fell silent as the first audible crack echoed through the morning air. Mrs. Jenkins gasped from her position near the corner store, her phone steady as she documented what was unfolding. Sarah felt her legal training kick in, mentally documenting every word and action, even as she fought to maintain her composure. Her fingers pressed the second discreet camera activation button under her steering wheel, capturing yet another angle of the unfolding disaster. Bradley seemed to relish the sound of cracking plastic, bringing the license closer to his face in a theatrical display of inspection that fooled no one watching. You see, he continued, his voice dripping with false authority, when people come into neighborhoods like this, in cars like this, showing IDs like this, well, his fingers pressed harder, causing another crack to spider web across her license. Well, they usually trying to hide something, his grammar deliberately deteriorating as his show of power reached its climax. Sarah thought about the irony of the situation. Just yesterday, she had led a workshop on professional interaction between law enforcement and civilians at the very station where Bradley worked. Though she didn't recognize him, she wondered if he had been one of the officers who had signed the mandatory attendance sheet, but spent the session scrolling through their phones. Her fingers remained steady on the steering wheel, even as her mind raced through the legal implications of what she was witnessing. The final crack of her license breaking resonated like a gunshot in the tense morning air. Bradley had crossed a line that would end up costing him far more than he could imagine. In that moment, fragments of Sarah's ID caught the sunlight as they dangled from his grip, a metaphorical representation of how he viewed her humanity. The cameras caught everything from his satisfied smirk to the exact pressure points his fingers had applied, evidence that would be scrutinized by forensic experts in the coming weeks. Somewhere in the gathered crowd, someone whispered, "Isn't that the mayor's sister?" But Bradley remained oblivious to the magnitude of his mistake. Caught up in his performance of power, he held the mangled remains of her license out to her, like a warning. "See what happens when people try to play above their station," he sneered, the words coming out just clear enough for the multiple recording devices capturing the scene, words that would soon be played in court chambers and police review boards across the country. Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she watched her broken license descend toward her window, the same calm she experienced before winning major cases or closing multimillion-dollar deals. She knew in that moment that Officer James Bradley had just sealed his fate. Her brother's police reform initiative would now have a face and a story that no one could ignore. The system of power that Bradley represented was about to face a reckoning he never saw coming. As the pieces of her license fell onto her car's pristine leather seat, Sarah stared at the broken pieces of her license scattered across her leather seat while Officer Bradley continued his performance. Seemingly energized by his display of authority, she drew in a slow breath, channeling the same composure that had earned her a reputation as an unshakable force in corporate negotiations. Her hand moved slightly toward her phone's emergency contact button, which would send her location to her brother the mayor, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Listen here, little miss," important Bradley sneered, leaning further into her car window, his badge scraping against the pristine paint job. "You people think you can just drive through here in your fancy cars, flashing your fake IDs, trying to pretend you're somebody." His hand still rested casually on his weapon, a gesture Sarah recognized from her work on police intimidation tactics for the Civilian Oversight Committee she had helped establish last year. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, recording every word as Bradley continued his tirade, unaware that his career was unraveling with each passing second. Sarah could see Mrs. Jenkins in her rearview mirror, already sending the video to local news contacts she had developed during previous incidents in the neighborhood. The morning sun caught the broken edges of her license, creating tiny prisms of light that seemed to mock Bradley's authority. "Officer Bradley," Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of her Harvard law education and years of boardroom experience, "I need to inform you that your actions are inappropriate and in violation of Department Policy Code 47B regarding the handling of civilian identification." Her precise citation of police code caught Bradley off guard, though his sneer quickly returned, masking his momentary surprise. "You threatening me now?" he growled, his hand tightening on his weapon, while his other hand reached for his radio. "You lawyers think you know everything about police work." His voice dripped with disdain as he deliberately misinterpreted her professional knowledge as a threat. "Don't you know threatening an officer is a serious offense?" He emphasized the word serious with a coldness that had likely terrorized countless others in similar situations. Sarah remained still, her years of experience analyzing police misconduct cases telling her that this moment would define the entire interaction. The cameras continued recording as she responded calmly, "I am simply stating facts, Officer Bradley, and requesting professional conduct in accordance with your department's standards." Her measured tone seemed to infuriate him further as he realized his usual intimidation tactics weren't having their intended effect. "You want to talk about professional conduct?" Bradley spat the words out like they tasted bitter. "Maybe we should discuss your suspicious behavior driving through this neighborhood, looking for trouble." His hand moved from his radio to his handcuffs, the metal catching the sunlight in a way that would later be analyzed frame by police conduct experts. "Did you know disorderly conduct can get you arrested?" he added with a smirk that spoke of years of unchecked power. The tension in the air thickened as Bradley unclipped his handcuffs, the sound drawing gasps from the onlooking crowd. Sarah thought about her brother sitting in the mayor's office less than a mile away, probably reviewing the very police conduct legislation she had helped draft last month. She thought about the community center kids who would be watching this video later, learning yet another lesson about justice in America. Sarah kept her voice steady as she delivered words that would soon echo through courtrooms and police reform debates across the country. Officer Bradley, I want to be clear that I am complying fully with your authority while reserving my right to report misconduct. She spoke each word with deliberate precision, knowing they would be replayed countless times in the coming months. Your body camera, along with my vehicle's recording systems and the witnesses' phones, are documenting everything that happens here. Bradley froze for a split second, his trained instincts finally catching up with his emotions as he processed her words, but his pride quickly overcame his judgment. Oh, so you're one of those troublemakers, he sneered, reaching for his handcuffs again. Let's see how your fancy cameras help you downtown. His voice carried a threat that had probably worked hundreds of times before, but this time he had chosen the wrong target on the wrong morning in front of too many witnesses. Within hours of the incident, the video of Officer Bradley destroying Sarah's license exploded across social media platforms, spreading like wildfire through community groups and police accountability networks. Mrs. Jenkins' original post had been shared over 50,000 times before lunch, with celebrities, activists, and political figures amplifying the footage that showed every second of Bradley's abuse of power in crystal clear resolution. Mayor Michael Thompson was in the middle of a budget meeting when his chief of staff burst in with the news that his sister had been harassed by police. The mayor's face remained stoic as he watched the multiple camera angles of the incident, his years of political training barely concealing the fury that built with each frame, showing his own officer destroying his sister's license in an act of blatant intimidation. The irony of this happening just days before his planned announcement of new police accountability measures wasn't lost on him. News vans began arriving outside City Hall, their satellite dishes creating a forest of metal and wires as reporters clamored for statements from the mayor's office. Local activists, who had long supported Michael Thompson's police reform initiatives, organized an impromptu rally on the steps, their signs bearing slogans that would soon trend nationwide. Police reform now and justice for Sarah competing with winter is coming for top Twitter hashtags that afternoon. Inside the police precinct, Officer Bradley was starting to realize the magnitude of his mistake. As fellow officers avoided eye contact in the break room, the video playing on repeat on every news channel showed his face clearly as he systematically violated at least 7 different department protocols. His supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, had already called him into the office twice, each time looking more grim as new angles of the footage surfaced and public outrage grew. Sarah, meanwhile, had transformed her corporate office into a command center for what was quickly becoming a landmark case in police accountability. Her legal team from Harvard Law School had already volunteered their services pro bono, while civil rights organizations flooded her inbox with offers of support. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from community leaders who had worked with her on various projects, all offering to testify about her character and long-standing commitment to bridging gaps between law enforcement and minorities. Social media exploded with previous victims of Officer Bradley coming forward, sharing their own stories of encounters with him, a pattern emerging that would later become crucial evidence in court. Local news stations began digging into Bradley's record, discovering a history of complaints that had been quietly buried over the years, each new revelation adding fuel to the fire that was now threatening to consume the entire department's reputation. The courthouse steps became a gathering place for protesters and supporters alike, their numbers growing as the afternoon wore on. Signs bearing Sarah's corporate headshot next to images of her destroyed license became powerful symbols of the disconnect between professional success and persistent prejudice. Community organizers began planning town halls and forums to address the broader implications of what the incident represented. Mayor Thompson called an emergency press conference, his usual commanding presence somehow even more powerful as he addressed the situation without once mentioning his personal connection to the victim. His measured words about systematic change and accountability carried extra weight as viewers across the country now understood exactly why police reform had been his top priority since taking office. In her office, Sarah watched the coverage while preparing for what she knew would be a lengthy legal battle. Her corporate experience in handling high-stakes negotiations would prove invaluable in the coming months as she prepared to take on not just one officer, but an entire system that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Her phone lit up with a message from one of the youth she mentored at the community center asking if she was okay, reminding her exactly why this fight was so important. By evening, the story had gone national, major networks picking up the footage, and running it alongside statistics about police misconduct and racial profiling. Officer Bradley's actions becoming a catalyst for a broader conversation about power, accountability, and justice in modern America. Sarah sat in her brother's office as they prepared for the legal battle ahead, knowing that their fight would impact not just their city, but could set precedents for police reform across the country. The packed courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the prosecution prepared to play the video evidence on the large screens mounted on either side of the chamber. Sarah sat composed in a cream-colored blazer, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confident demeanor cracking under the weight of what was about to be shown. District Attorney Maria Ramirez stood before the jury, her presence commanding attention as she introduced the first piece of evidence. "This is not just about a broken license," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "What you are about to witness is an abuse of power that has been happening in our city for far too long." The giant screens flickered to life, showing the pristine morning when everything changed. The first angle from Sarah's dashboard camera showed Bradley approaching her car, his swagger and intimidating posture now visible to everyone present. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her glasses catching the light as she studied every detail of the officer's body language. The jury watched intently as multiple angles captured Bradley's increasingly aggressive behavior. His attorney sank lower in his chair as the crystal-clear footage left no room for alternative interpretation. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the moment of destruction played out in high definition. The sound of Sarah's license cracking seemed to reverberate off the wooden panels. Even Bradley's most staunch supporters from the police union, sitting in the back row, winced at the obvious display of unnecessary force. The forensics expert waited in the wings, ready to testify about the exact pressure required to damage the license in such a manner. De Ramirez paused the footage on a frame that captured Bradley's sneer perfectly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, turning to face them, "notice the officer's left hand positioning that deliberately blocks his body camera, while his right hand destroys Ernst Thompson's property." She gestured to a second screen where a technical analysis showed the exact angle of concealment, a technique that would soon be revealed as common practice among officers attempting to avoid accountability. Bradley stared straight ahead as his own body cam footage began to play, revealing long gaps and conveniently obscured angles that contradicted his official report. The defense attorney frantically scribbled notes, knowing that each second of video evidence dismantled their carefully constructed narrative of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. Sarah watched the officer who had tried to intimidate her, now looking smaller in his pressed uniform as his actions were laid bare before the court. The prosecution then introduced Mrs. Jenkins' video showing the incident from the community perspective. Dozens of phones raised, recording the abuse of power that had become all too familiar in their neighborhood. The jury listened intently as audio enhancement revealed background conversations of witnesses expressing recognition of the mayor's sister. Bradley visibly paled as this detail emerged on screen, his realization of who he had targeted playing across his face for all to see. Judge Martinez watched the final piece of evidence, Sarah's secondary camera angle, which captured Bradley's face in perfect detail. As he made disparaging remarks about her status and intelligence, the judge's expression remained neutral, while her pen moved steadily across her notepad, documenting points that would later feature prominently in her landmark ruling on police conduct and accountability. The defense team had fought hard to suppress certain angles of the footage, claiming technical violations, but the multiple sources of video evidence created an airtight case, each angle corroborating the others in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Expert witnesses from the police academy waited outside, ready to testify about proper procedures for handling civil. Cross-examination began on the third day of the trial, with Officer Bradley taking the stand, his polished badge catching the morning light streaming through the high courthouse windows as he adjusted his collar for the fifth time in as many minutes. District Attorney Ramirez approached the witness stand with a stack of files, each one containing complaints filed against Bradley over his 20-year career, files that had mysteriously disappeared from the police database until the mayor's cybersecurity team recovered them. Officer Bradley maintained his practiced stance of authority as DA Ramirez began her questioning, his responses coming out in clipped professional tones that had perfected over years of testifying in court. But today was different. Today, he faced a prosecutor armed with irrefutable evidence and a determination to expose the truth about his long history of targeting successful minorities in upscale vehicles. "Can you explain, Officer Bradley, why your body camera malfunctioned at exactly the moment you approached Ernst Thompson's vehicle?" Ramirez asked, her voice carrying a hint of steel that made several jurors lean forward. The question hung in the air As Bradley shifted in his seat, "I felt threatened," he began, but the words sounded hollow against the backdrop of video evidence, showing Sarah's calm professional demeanor throughout the encounter. The prosecution methodically displayed case after case on the courtroom screens, previous incidents involving Bradley and minority drivers in luxury vehicles, each one following a disturbing pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Expert testimony from Dr. Marcus Chen, a leading authority on law enforcement bias, revealed that Bradley's stop and search rates for minorities in high-end cars were 8 times higher than those of his fellow officers. Sarah sat with perfect posture at the prosecution table, her presence a silent reminder of everything Bradley had underestimated that morning, her Harvard Law degree and extensive work in police reform now serving as powerful counterpoints to the defense team's attempts to paint her as combative during the stop. Bradley avoided looking in her direction as evidence mounted of his systematic targeting of successful minorities in the neighborhood. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Ramirez introduced text messages recovered from Bradley's department phone messages showing him bragging to fellow officers about putting certain people in their place. The defense attorney objected frantically, but Judge Martinez allowed the evidence, citing its direct relevance to establishing pattern and intent. Bradley's face reddened as his own words appeared on screen for all to see. "Officer Bradley, perhaps you could explain this message sent just minutes after your encounter with Ms. Thompson," Ramirez suggested, holding up a transcript that made several jurors shake their heads in disbelief. "Showed another fancy car owner who's boss today." Bradley stared at his hands, unable to meet the eyes of the jury as his casual boast about destroying Sarah's license was displayed in stark black and white. Testimony from fellow officers revealed a deeper pattern of misconduct. Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez broke ranks to describe how Bradley had coached younger officers on techniques to obscure body camera footage during stops, her voice steady as she detailed the unwritten rules that had protected officers like Bradley for years in the galley. Members of the Police Reform Committee Sarah had established took careful notes, their pens scratching against paper as they documented every revelation. The prosecution presented statistics compiled by the Civilian Oversight Board showing a clear correlation between Bradley's traffic stops and complaints from minority professionals. Bradley attempted to explain away the numbers, citing his high arrest record, but his voice faltered as Ramirez displayed evidence that none of those arrests had led to convictions, his entire approach to policing unraveling under the harsh light of scrutiny. As the afternoon wore on, Bradley's testimony became increasingly defensive, his responses contradicting both the video evidence and his own previous statements. Judge Martinez watched with narrowed eyes as he attempted to justify his actions that morning, his claims of feeling threatened growing less convincing with each piece of evidence showing his calculated approach to intimidation. Sarah's legal team exchanged knowing glances as Bradley's carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of truth. The day concluded with the introduction of testimony from Dr. James Wilson, a forensic expert who analyzed the exact force required to break a driver's license, the evidence definitively proving that Bradley's actions were deliberate and calculated, requiring sustained pressure that could not be accidental as the defense had tried to claim. In the gallery, Sarah's brother, the mayor, watched silently as the system he fought to reform exposed its deepest flaws through one officer's downfall. The defense team launched their final desperate strategy, attempting to paint Sarah as someone exploiting her brother's political influence to target hardworking police officers. Lead defense attorney Richard Maxwell stood before the jury, his expensive suit failing to mask the nervous energy that radiated from him as he prepared to present their narrative of Sarah Thompson as an entitled troublemaker who had orchestrated the entire incident for political gain. Maxwell paced before the jury, his footsteps echoing through the hushed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have a woman who lives in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, driving through a high-crime area in an expensive vehicle, clearly looking to provoke a response from law enforcement." His words hung in the air for a moment before the prosecution called their surprise witness, Dr. Emily Chen, director of the community center where Sarah had volunteered every Tuesday for the past 8 years. Dr. Chen approached the stand, her quiet dignity commanding attention as she described how Sarah had established the center's youth mentorship program long before her brother became mayor. Security footage from the center played on the courtroom screens, showing Sarah working with underprivileged teens, teaching them business skills and helping them apply for college scholarships. The defense team's attempts to question her credibility faltered as years of documented community service unfolded before the jury. Next came James Wilson, a former gang member turned successful business owner who credited Sarah with helping him secure funding for his now thriving construction company. His testimony detailed how Sarah had spent countless hours reviewing his business plan, offering guidance, and connecting him with investors, all while her brother was still a city council member. The defense team's narrative of political opportunism crumbled as witness after witness testified to Sarah's long-standing commitment to community development. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair as his own precinct colleagues took the stand, revealing how he had openly mocked Sarah's police reform workshops, refusing to attend mandatory sensitivity training sessions, and encouraging other officers to do the same. Officer Maria Rodriguez testified about overhearing Bradley make disparaging remarks about successful minorities driving luxury cars in his patrol area, her words corroborating the pattern of targeted harassment that the prosecution had established. The courtroom fell silent as the defense attempted to cross-examine Diana Washington, a retired teacher who had witnessed the incident. From her testimony about Bradley's aggressive behavior, matching perfectly with the video evidence, while she described similar encounters she had observed over her 30 years living in the neighborhood. Maxwell struggled to discredit her observations, but her clear recall and steady demeanor only reinforced the prosecution's case. Mayor Thompson himself took the stand, much to the defense team's visible dismay, his testimony focusing not on his sister, but on the broader pattern of complaints his office had received about Officer Bradley over the years. The mayor's measured words about systematic abuse of power and the need for accountability carried extra weight as he described how his own family member had fallen victim to the very behavior his reform initiatives sought to address. Surveillance footage from local businesses near the traffic stop revealed Bradley had targeted 3 other luxury vehicles driven by minorities that same morning before encountering Sarah. The defense team's attempts to explain these stops as routine patrol work collapsed as timestamp analysis showed Bradley had ignored several traffic violations by non-minority drivers during the same period, the evidence of selected enforcement mounting with each new video clip. Sarah's professional accomplishments became a powerful counter to the defense's portrayal of her as an agitator. Her corporate diversity initiatives, awards for community service, and appointment to multiple civic oversight committees painted a picture of someone dedicated to building bridges rather than creating conflict. Even Bradley's own supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, testified about Sarah's collaborative approach to police reform, describing workshops she had conducted aimed at improving community relations. As the defense's final witness crumbled under cross-examination, Sarah sat quietly watching her brother's police reform vision transform from policy proposals into living testimony. The jury listened intently as evidence of her decades-long commitment to community development, systematic change, and professional achievement dismantled every attempt to discredit her character. Maxwell's closing argument approach and the tension in the courtroom mounted as everyone present sensed that justice was about to take an historic turn. Judge Martinez adjusted her robes as she prepared to deliver the verdict, the packed courtroom crackling with anticipation as weeks of testimony, evidence, and revelations about systematic police misconduct culminated. In this moment, Sarah sat perfectly still, her professional composure masking the thunder of her heartbeat, while Officer Bradley stared straight ahead, his once proud shoulders now bearing the weight of his exposed actions. In a landmark decision that would reshape police departments across the country, Judge Martinez found Officer Bradley guilty on all counts, her voice carrying the gravity of history as she listed each violation: civil rights violations, abuse of power, destruction of property, harassment, and misconduct. The judge specifically cited the officer's pattern of targeting successful minorities as an aggravating factor that demanded the maximum penalties under law. Bradley stood motionless as the judge ordered his immediate termination from the force, along with substantial punitive damages that would later fund new police accountability initiatives across the city. The requirement for him to undergo extensive rehabilitation and sensitivity training seemed almost ironic given his previous mockery of such programs. Sarah watched as the officer who had tried to humiliate her now faced the consequences of years of unchecked prejudice. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as Judge Martinez announced additional department-wide reforms: mandatory body camera upgrades with automatic upload, features new civilian oversight committees, and enhanced training programs, all stemming from the evidence revealed during the trial. Sarah caught her brother's eye across the room, seeing in his expression the same determination that had driven their shared vision of systematic change. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered holding signs that would become symbols of the police reform movement. Sarah stepped into the bright sunlight, her cream-colored blazer standing out against the sea of supporters, her voice steady as she announced the establishment of the Thompson Justice Initiative, a foundation funded by the settlement that would provide resources for police accountability programs and support for victims of law enforcement misconduct. Media cameras flashed, capturing the moment as Sarah detailed the foundation's first project, a comprehensive training program developed in partnership with law enforcement agencies nationwide. Dr. Chen stood beside her, representing the community leaders who would help implement these changes, while James Wilson announced a scholarship program for underprivileged youth interested in law enforcement careers, creating a pipeline for positive change from within the system. Mayor Thompson addressed the crowd, his words carrying the weight of both personal and professional victory as he outlined sweeping police department reforms that would become a model for cities across the nation. The presence of several police chiefs from neighboring jurisdictions signaled the beginning of a regional commitment to accountability and reform. Officer Rodriguez, now promoted to lead the new Internal Affairs Division, stood proudly among them. In the following months, Sarah's case became required study material at police academies nationwide, her dashboard camera footage serving as a powerful teaching tool for proper civilian interaction. The Thompson Justice Initiative expanded rapidly, establishing Bradley's former colleagues underwent mandatory retraining, many expressing shock at their own unconscious biases revealed through enhanced sensitivity programs. The police union, initially resistant to change, found itself transformed into a partner for reform as younger officers embraced the new era of accountability and community connection. Sarah's regular workshops, now attended by officers from across the country, became forums for honest dialogue and understanding. 1 year after the verdict, Sarah stood at the podium of the National Police Reform Conference, her keynote speech drawing attendance from law enforcement leaders nationwide. Behind her played clips from that fateful morning, interspersed with images of the positive changes that had emerged from the darkness of that encounter. The broken license that had symbolized broken trust now transformed into a catalyst for healing and transformation. Mrs. Jenkins watched from her corner store as new officers patrolled the neighborhood. Their body cameras prominently displayed their interactions with community members, marked by respect and professionalism. The Thompson Justice Initiative had installed surveillance cameras throughout the area, not to monitor citizens but to protect them, ensuring that every interaction between police and public remained transparent and accountable. As Sarah concluded her speech, she held up her new driver's license alongside the preserved pieces of the old one, powerful symbols of how destruction could lead to reconstruction, her words echoing through the conference hall about the importance of turning moments of injustice into opportunities for lasting change. In the audience, Officer Bradley's replacement, a young woman from the neighborhood, sat attentively, representing the new generation of law enforcement that would carry this legacy forward.